time you turn it on. So thank you. And even rattling of potato chip bags and things like that, the mic picks all that up. So thank you. Okay, so kind of what started me thinking about movie theaters was that you all know that the movie theater downtown, the Pastime, has been sold, and it's now closed and will be remodeled and reopened, I guess in August, I think is what they're planning. So we were very fortunate to be given by Dennis Boy and his family some of the things that he had collected that were in his office and things like that. So that's what kind of started me thinking about this, but it just became a real maze of where and when early movie theaters were, not only in Maquoketa, but over Jackson County. And I realized how really very little information we have about some of these and some of these places. So I'd like to depend upon all of you today. Please feel free to weigh in. If you have memories and stories and knowledge and things about early theaters, just help me out. Okay, so I was going to start with Maquoketa, and it just seems like, going through old newspapers and things, that one of the earliest theaters in Maquoketa was the Lyric Theater. And I know everybody's going to say, oh, the Lyric Theater was in Preston. But there was a Lyric Theater earlier than that in Maquoketa. So again, trying to piece everything together has been kind of challenging. But I saw a thing when we were doing a program about Johnny Wright. And you all know Johnny Wright was Maquoketa's professional musician, played the piano beautifully, etc. And he used to give recitals at the old Lyric movie theater on North Main Street. But we didn't know where on North Main Street was, and we still don't. But he played there for silent movies. So if anybody has any information about an old North Main Street movie theater, that would be really, really helpful. In 1907, we know that it was in operation because there was an article in the paper about how they had to suspend operations for a few days because the lantern operator was arrested for thievery. And it turns out that he had been sent here by the film manufacturers to run the moving picture machine until Mr. Conrad, the manager, could hire one. And this man who was here just doing that was kind of moving from hotel to boarding house to boarding house, and things were just disappearing. And when he was finally arrested, he said, well, he was just picking up presents for Christmas that was coming up. So he was shopping for Christmas presents. Then in 1910, there's another interesting article about the Lyric Theater. It was owned by Cooper and Butler, and they had installed a raised platform going up so people in the back were elevated and could see, and 200 opera chairs for their Main Street Picture Show house, which was at the most convenient location in town. So putting two and two together, we think that that location was the Centennial Building, right in the middle of Main Street, where Maquoketa Art Experience is now, I think. And they said that they were using Powers No. 5 flickerless picture machines, and they were to be finer than ever before, and this was the most popular and comfortable picture show in the whole area. It cost a whole 10 cents for adults to go and 5 cents for children. And then the Saturday matinees that were the busiest, it was 5 cents for adults to bring their children, and children under 10 were free. So, and then it was always promised that as soon as talkies were available, they would have the equipment and they would have talkies. Well, one of the early people that was involved in this was a man by the name of R.J. Hamill. And R.J. Hamill was a musician. He ran the Academy of Music, as you can see here. This is his parade float. And his orchestra was constantly employed to furnish the music for the silent pictures. Because as you remember, there was no sound, just words at the bottom of the screen. And so there was just always music in the background. And by the year's end, it had changed hands again, and Professor Hamill, who you see right here, there's Professor R.J. Hamill, he became the owner of the Lyric Theater. So, the Centennial Building, where we think this was, and that's a later picture, as you can see, of the Centennial Building. The Sentinel reported in 1911 that the Lyric Theater was going to have to leave the Centennial Building because Adam Ringlet had purchased this store and he was remodeling it to be used as a huge hardware store. And you can see his name is still up there. And I was sad when they did the reconstruction of the Centennial Building recently. You could still see, very faintly, you could see the Ringlet Hardware Store sign still up there. And I felt they should have left that, but they went to great lengths to remove that. Didn't work at first, but they finally got the job done. But I thought that would have been nice to have left that up there. So, old landmark. And we know that maybe the next movie theater was right in this area. And you realize where we are now. This is the corner. Right across the street is the Copper Cardinal Pizza Place, right? So this is Platt Street and North and South Main Street. So we're talking about this area right here. And this is what we'll refer to as the Masonic Building because that's who owned the building most of the time. But that's where the Orpheum Theater was. Now we know that we don't know when it started for sure, but by 1913, the Orpheum Theater was definitely a thing. And according to all the local papers, the new Orpheum Picture Show opened in 1915. So here you see it getting ready. They're getting ready for the opening. And you remember when Maquoketa was redoing Main Street, and they were taking up the sidewalks, and all of a sudden they found all these things underneath the sidewalk, and how amazed everybody was. Well, back in the day, this was common. Because these were little stairwells that went down to the lower buildings, and every one of the buildings up and down Main Street had a business underneath it. And it was pretty amazing. We found out some interesting things. This one you can see was Joel's Brothers Plumbing. And usually it was the plumbers and people like that that were down in the downstairs. A lot of times beauty shops, barber shops, and that sort of thing. So this is the building that they're getting ready. They're building the columns and they're getting ready to make this into this awesome movie theater called the Orpheum. Then it was just called the Orpheum. But in all the publicity at the time, the managers, Morrison and Hadley, were stating that there was going to be no comparison between the new Orpheum and the Electric. So it was indicating that there was another movie theater, I think, called the Electric, and we know nothing about that. Because it said the one from which it has sprung. So if anybody knows anything about the Electric, we're lucky. Okay, so the new theater, and there it is, still with the entry going downstairs to the plumber. The new theater was going to seat 415 people. It had modern steam heat. I think it's the same heat that's still down there. 20 by 26 foot stage. And then they always, in their advertising, went to great care to talk about the steel ceilings and the steel booths and 4 exits for safety. And that's because there were so many fires back in the day that people were wary to go into a large theater like this for fear there would be a fire and they would not be able to get out and that sort of thing. So that's a big part of all the advertisement, how many exits they were and how fireproof it was. So the appearance of this theater was supposed to be metropolitan. And it was from the tile floor in the lobby back to the rear of the stage. And it played only mutual film features. And that meant that nothing was going to be shown upon this screen that could possibly offend the most fastidious. And they also had a 5-piece orchestra which played. Now I only see 4 people, but they talk about the 5-man band, 5 names, 5 people, and of course the members changed from time to time, but you can see who was there. Managers changed often. Later managers were Mr. Gregory and Mr. Vaughn. And in 1919, a long time ago, in 1919, reportedly 2,300 people saw the movie Mickey at the new Orpheum Theaters. Tickets then were 35 cents for adults and 25 cents for children. But I can tell from their pricing that this varied with movies. And one of their other things was they wanted to have the biggest and the best because they wanted to keep business in Maquoketa. Now, my thinking was in 1919, how easy was it to go to Davenport or Dubuque or Clinton to see a movie? Wouldn't it have been kind of difficult? Yeah. But they were trying to keep everything really good so people would stay here. Another interesting thing that they did at this theater was on Christmas Day of 1919, they invited 1 million children under 12 to come from a radius of 1 million miles to see The Romance of Tarzan. And they hired chaperones, and they assured parents that chaperones would be in charge and all would be well. And this whole thing was sponsored by the Excelsior Record newspaper. So, in 1921, the Orpheum got off to a strong start, and it had many, many great movies going. And then there was an article in the paper that was interesting, a story called Truth is Stranger Than Fiction. Maquoketa is touched by the unusual. And there was a man and a woman by the name of Mr. and Mrs. John A. Schroeder, and they had separated many years prior, and then they lost track of each other. Well, there was a 1-year-old child involved. Later on, the mother and child received information that John Schroeder had been killed in a train wreck. And so they went through the years thinking that he was dead. And in fact, even his own family, his own mother, thought that he was deceased. Well, by accident, somebody came to Maquoketa and saw him walking down the streets of Maquoketa, and word got back to the family that he was still alive. And so the daughter that he hadn't seen for 20 years contacted him. Her real name was Bernadetta, and she was then 22 years old, but her screen name was Eileen Burdett, and she was playing in Romeo and Juliet. Well, she told him that it might be coming to a theater near him, so he called the Orpheum, and that very night, that's what was playing. And so this Maquoketa man went to the movie and saw his only child on the screen at the Orpheum Theater. So that was a big thing in Maquoketa. We have a record and receipt book from the Chief up here, if you want to look at it, the Chief Theater. The Orpheum down through time became many things, but it was the Chief Theater later on. So when we started looking at the Pastime Theater, the first time that the Pastime Theater shows up is in 1910. Joe Roberts was the proprietor, and Max Wright, who sold cars and things in Maquoketa, was his partner, and they transformed the south room of the Rice Block into a little up-to-date playhouse. That's what they called movie houses back then, playhouses, where the public could be entertained for an hour, and they would either see refined vaudeville or the very best in motion pictures and illustrated songs. And I don't know what illustrated songs are, if anybody knows. It had a 120 by 30 foot building. So, and if you remember, the Rice building was sort of in the area where the Goodwill store is now, that big brick building that came down to build that. Again, it had the raised seats, so they built this ramp sort of thing. Then they put all of these upholstered seats, theater seats, and it opened in 1910. Had beautiful artwork all around it that was just lauded in all of the papers. Again, adults were 10 cents for a movie and children were 5 cents. But by December, now that was in August, by December of that year, they had sold the theater to J.P. Broderson. So that's where we think the first Pastime was. So that Pastime then had its own orchestra called the Pastime Orchestra. It was really the Maquoketa Harp Orchestra, and it was under the direction of Frank Keeney. And Clarence Green was the baritone that sang. Frank Keeney, you'll remember, is Odette Keene's father. And so they were quite the musical family. And this was a very, back in the day, a very famous band. But they performed at the Pastime Theater playing for the silent movies. we see an ad from 1912 where Broderson, who had purchased this, and Galuska were involved. If any of you heard Just Talk this past week, last week, Mr. Kahn was on, and he was talking about Galuska, who was a great band director from this area. And so this is the Galuska we're talking about here. And so they had a formal announcement of the opening of the Pastime Theater at its new home. And they said the new home was just south of the post office. Well, the post office also moved a lot, so trying to figure out where that new home was for sure has been a bit of a mystery. And it had a 13-foot by 26-foot stage, and again, advertising the great ventilation. The ventilation of the rear fans to suck out all the impure air. And it had a balcony built over the entrance to increase the seating capacity to 400, and many rear exits for safety. And there we see the disastrous fire of 1915. And at that time we know that Brinker and Robinson, and they're more modern names to you, Howard Brinker and Robinson, owned the Pastime Theater, and they still owned it in 1921. And that is, as you can see, on the east side of South Main Street. And they would have been the owners of the Pastime when this big fire broke out. So you can see there, that must be the Pastime. The Lane Furniture Store was right next door. It was completely burned. A lot of damage was done during that fire. But then that was in 1915. By 1916, everything was completely rebuilt. And here you see the Pastime, oops, sorry. Here you see the Pastime Theater, the rebuilt Pastime Theater. And so now we know where that was. So it opened on August 2nd, and it ran for a long time. In 1939, it was remodeled again. But we found something very interesting about this theater as well. In December of 1919, and you remember that that's during World War I, right? Maquoketa had a fuel committee. A fuel committee was used to regulate the opening and closing time of businesses, depending on how many hours of heat and light that business could use during the day. So, electric signs and window lights were prohibited. You could not have those at all. Street lights on the street were reduced down to what they considered the very minimum for safety purposes. Churches could have one service on Sundays. Retailers could be open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and movie theaters could be open from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. Those were the only hours that you were allowed to use heat and electricity. So I hadn't thought about that. I thought that was pretty interesting. So here we see the inside of the Pastime Theater, and this, I'm sure you've all seen this picture. It's a wonderful little picture. But as you know, before 1921, movies were silent movies, and actors' words appeared along the bottom of the screen, and the orchestra, you see the orchestra pit there, the orchestra played along. In Maquoketa, Odette Keene played the piano at many of the Pastime movie things, and my Aunt Mimi, Marie Wells, also played the piano. She probably played on the days that Odette had off, I think. But the first sound motion picture that the Pastime had was on April 21st of 1929, and the movie was entitled His Captive Woman. And in 1922, they had their own Pastime orchestra. Okay, 1921, this man came to town. His name was Stuart Peake, and he and his father-in-law, Mr. Hitler, bought the Pastime and the Orpheum and maybe the Lyric Theater if it was still around. They bought them, they came, they moved to town, and they took over. The Orpheum Theater was, as we said, located on the first floor of the Masonic Building, and that's when they remodeled it to become the new Orpheum. And it was interesting how they decided to arrange their schedule, and there are some up here, but it was almost as if they had too many people in Maquoketa going to movies to have only one movie theater on the weekends, so they needed two. But during the week, there weren't enough people to support two movie theaters, so they had just one. So that's how they arranged their schedules. But finally, they decided that Maquoketa didn't need two theaters, and so the Orpheum was made into a miniature golf course. And that was in the late 20s, so probably nobody remembers that. And then when the miniature golf craze died out, it was reverted again to be a theater. And it was in 1948 that it became the Chief Theater. We have no pictures of that, but it became the Chief Theater. We do have, I think, a roll of tickets up here that came from the Chief Theater. So we have some posters and things like that, but just no pictures. So that would make the time about 1951. Okay, going back again a little bit, and this goes back and forth, and as you begin to have stories or remember some of these things as we get into later times, please speak up. So this is a picture of the pastime in the 40s. Hitler and Pieck were all about, and this is a quote, keeping the smaller cities neck and neck with the more pretentious burgs. They wanted everything to be here so nobody traveled out of town to spend their money. So they added a $2,500 electric sign to advertise their movies. It cost them $60 a month to run the lighting on this sign. They were colored in incandescent flashing lights, flashing intermittently, displaying the feature movie being shown and the principal stars in the picture. And may have been a little on the gaudy side, but it was said to be a great asset to mainstream Maquoketa. So,
that's
yes.
That's the brewery, isn't it? Where the brewery is?
No.
No?
No. So
Farther north?
this is where...
It's on the other side.
Oh, on the east side, you're right,
Yes,
east side.
on the east side, you bet. No,
Sorry,
please.
it
Nope.
looks a lot like the windows on ours. but-
Nope, it's a good, I just assume everybody's as old as I am, and so they remember these things. Okay, Jerry Rasmussen, one of my heroes. So he wrote a lot in his book, The Maquoketa I Remember, about the pastime theater. And this is kind of what he said. And again, please chime in. He said, attendance was excellent, usually two full houses on weekends when they showed 2 shows each night. 2 ushers with flashlights were necessary to walk up and down the aisles and keep people quiet and help them find their seats and whatever. And often folks were lined up clear down the street waiting to get in. Then Jerry remembered Mrs. Pieck. Now we saw Mr. Pieck, but we don't have a picture of Mrs. Pieck. But he talks often about her sitting in the ticket office. She was very particular about her appearance, and she sat in the box office like a beautiful bird in a gilded cage. Her hair was arranged just so, high on her head, and her makeup was always applied to perfection. She always wore beautiful, high-quality dresses. Now I'll tell you, I sold tickets from that same box office, and nobody ever said anything like that about me. He talks about her quite a bit. So he said the usual thing was there would be a newsreel that we all remember, a cartoon, and then the feature film. One night a week would be bank night, and there would be a drawing for a large amount of cash. Does anybody remember bank nights? Because they went on for a very long time. You could win a lot of money. New Year's Eves were always fun. They had party hats and confetti and streamers and horns. And there were the 3D movies. Now, I do remember the 3D movies. They handed out these special glasses when you went in. One side was red, one side was green, and then when you looked at the screen, it was definitely 3D. And they were always kind of horror films, I think. Monsters were always coming out at you and all kinds of things. But they were fun. So, for 40 years, the main projectionist at the Pastime Theater was a man by the name of Howard Brinker. He worked almost every night, but he had a backup. And his backup is here with us today, Kathy Bailey. She knew how to do things in that theater. So I asked her if she'd just say a few things about some memories she has about the theater.
Yeah, sometimes when Howard had to have a night off, then he had showed me how to operate the projectors. And back in those days, there were two big machines, and you had to watch the screen, and in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there'd be a little flick of light. And then, boy, you had to hurry up and switch over to that other machine and talk about tension. It was scary, because you think, oh, what if I mess up? And here's all this whole theater full of people, you know, but luckily I made it through every time, but it was fun.
I think Kathy did just about everything at the theater. She sold tickets.
Yeah,
What else did you do?
popcorn machine.
Oh, popcorn machine.
Yeah.
She and I both have scars on our arms for cleaning the popcorn machine. It was pretty hot.
Yep, yep.
Yeah. So chime in as we go along if you can think of anything else. Okay, so we're going along really well with the Pastime Theater, and all of a sudden in 1946, the owners and operators of the two local theaters were the Maquoketa Amusement Company. They'd been purchased again by this company from Des Moines, and a manager came to town by the name of C.R. Lindbad, and there he is. Well, he was affiliated with the Iowa United Theaters, and by then they were putting together syndicates of movie theaters. And this syndicate owned 20 theaters, and they operated each one as a separate company. G.L. Stockham was the contractor. I think he did all of these theaters over and over and over again. And he was making this, which is the old Orpheum, which again we're looking at the Masonic building where you saw they're making it into a new theater. 330 seats, gonna have a new V-shaped canopy out in front. And when they asked Mr. Lindblad what the name of this theater was going to be, he said he hadn't decided yet. So he was gonna have a contest and see what name came up. And I think that's where the chief came from, because this then became the Chief Theater. Okay, the Pastime Theater and the Orpheum were both sold to this Des Moines theater chain, and so things began to happen. He promised great changes at both of the museums, and these are just some pictures. So this is 1947 that we're talking about. This is what the Pastime looked like then. That's my bicycle sitting out in front, and this is it's just pretty interesting. Who remembers what was around the Pastime? Do you remember? I think Kathy. How many people worked at the Pastime over the years? Erlene did. Kathy did. Roger? Did you? No.
There was a
No.
Dick Ballou, there was
Yes.
to the left of it there. Dick Ballou had a little bit.
A watch shop, a
Watch
jewelry,
repair.
yeah, a watch repair shop.
No,
Evidently,
Upstairs was some medical, Skelly maybe? a
well,
dentist.
the Phillips, the dentist, Phillips? No, Ellis. Ellis, the dentist, was upstairs, and he was burned during the fire. His business got burned, but I think he rebuilt as well.
Right.
And so I think Marty Ballou, it was his father, Dick Ballou, a great guy. He had a watch shop there. And
the Lane Furniture Store was next.
And the Lane Furniture Store had burned, but it was rebuilt, right?
And my neighbor Frank Roth worked there for a long while.
Okay.
Gladys always baked pies and stuff as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Frank worked there.
I know going up the steep stairs, and these were some steep stairs going up to the second, third floors of these buildings. Going upstairs, I know that Enid King had a beauty shop up there for some time. Walk up those stairs to get your hair cut.
And Jack Willie was there,
Upstairs.
upstairs. What year was Jack there?
Really?
What year did Jack get his shop upstairs? Okay, before they got married.
Okay. That's a good answer. Okay.
They got married in the
Okay. But that's just kind of, you know, Dick Blue started out upstairs, then there was a little barber shop downstairs. Then I think the barber shop was gone and he moved downstairs, but that's just some of what was around there.
Oh, and the Green Mill across the street.
Oh, absolutely. Did I skip one? Yes, the Green Mill was awesome, across the street. Okay, so this is just kind of a picture. I was saying that the programs that they put out, and you would get one of these programs, and it was the movies for the month. And it always had for the pastime up here during the week and on weekends, and then down here, movies for the Chief Theater that were just shown on the weekends. So they used the same card, advertising card for both. And then there's a registration card for bank night, and you fill these out and turn these in, so you would be part of the drawing for the money. And this one is Mrs. Earl Saunders, which was Eva Mae Saunders, who was many of our teachers. She gave us these things, that's why her name's on that one. Ralph Saunders' mother, right?
Right.
I think so. Okay, so that's some of the things. They did, I'm showing you these just to say, some of the neat things that they did to promote movies, to get people to come. They were very clever. So they had a book of happiness, cost $2.50, had little coupons inside, little green stamp kind of coupons that were worth exactly the same amount. You could buy a box of popcorn, or you could buy, whatever. Book of happiness. And then they had good conduct student privilege tickets, as you see there. That's the front and the back. And so some of the rules are kind of interesting. So if you had a good student ticket, then you got special things at the movies. And the last one is, there was a payroll report stuck in with some of the stuff that they gave us, and you can see that they didn't earn a lot of money, but no one did back in the day. But here's Howard Brinker and Claude Backwright and Yvonne Sutton, my dear friend, been gone for a long time, and many of your dear friends. There's Yvonne Sutton when she worked there. She made $3.37 that week at the theater, and that's 1964. Okay, so a little help. See this man right here? These are the two projectors I believe Kathy's talking about, right? The two movie projectors. Is this Howard Brinker? Or
Yeah.
is that Howard or Claude?
I know, that's Howard.
That's Howard Brinker. Okay, there he is. With the very finest in motion picture equipment. So, that was just kind of funny. Okay, so starting to have some memories as we're getting further down in years. When I was there, Mr. Gray was the manager.
Right.
He was an interesting little guy. He was.
Yeah, he was.
Is that who you worked for as well, Ernie?
Yes.
Okay. And I will say about 2 or 3 years ago, his son came in to the museum, introduced himself as his son, and we just talked for a little bit, and that was kind of nice.
Jules just sent me some pictures to my phone, but you got some of those, because I told Jules you were doing this program today.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So chime in again if you have anything to add, please. Okay, so Claude Beck. Most of us know Claude Beck, who was Mark Beck's father, right? And worked at the theater for years and years, I believe. He started working there in high school, became assistant manager of the pastime. He was the assistant manager. And he was the manager of the Chief Theater when he returned from service. And there was an interesting story in with all this stuff that I was given. There was an interesting story about Claude. One night he locked up the pastime and started home, but for whatever, he needed to make a phone call. So he went back to the theater and unlocked and went in to make a phone call, and he found a man crouched under the seat of the ticket booth. So he rousted him out and sent him packing out the door, and went in to straighten up in there, and he heard a rattle when he moved the chair, and he said in the false bottom of the chair he found a loaded pistol. So he called the sheriff, but by then the man was gone. But interesting things happened. So it was 1958 or 59, probably 58. I was selling tickets in the cage, but wasn't the Gilded Bird or whoever she was. The beautiful bird in the gilded cage, that was not me. But that's when I first met Dennis Foy, and I know a lot of you met Dennis Foy right at that time. He was just this interesting, tall, big, young guy. He was really interesting and fun, and he arrived to work, and that night he went to the Green Mill, that first night in town, and then he walked across the street to the movie theater, and we've just been friends ever since. And then, found that one morning in 1972, long time later, right? Dennis was over in the Green Mill having coffee, and he walked out kind of stunned. He had just bought the 61 Drive-In Theater from Bud McKenzie. So it was 1972 when Dennis bought that. It was also 1972 when Ed Kirchhoff bought the Pastime back from this Des Moines company. And he announced that he was tearing it down to make room for a new Schultz store. Well, the businessmen in Maquoketa were, everybody was upset. They didn't want the theater torn down. And so the businessmen in Maquoketa convinced Dennis to buy the Pastime. So November 10th of 1972, Dennis bought the Pastime. But the terms of the contract that he had to sign were that it had to be closed by January 31st of 1973. That's a very short little bit of time. But that's how we got the new Voight Theater at 207 South Main Street. And that had been International Harvester Farm Store way back in the day. It had been the Millwright Farm Store, but just right there to the south of that building, between the Masonic Building and the Hearst Hotel, that little strip right there, that big farm implement store that had been there. Well, Dennis put his theaters there. The first theater that Dennis built, Boy Number 1, had 224 rocker-type seats. It had air conditioning, which was very important, and it opened in 1973. Then in 1975, Dennis opened the Voy 2. And by 1981, he opened the Voy 3, and that made Maquoketa the smallest town in Iowa that had a triplex theater. And part of that theater was on property that the Orpheum Theater had been on a long time before. So we've all been in that building a lot, I'm quite sure. I was in there just recently. All the seats are gone, everything's gone.
I was just going to mention, I wonder if then that's why he couldn't tear down that building. They tore down the building at 146 South Main.
Yes, probably.
So that was
Putting the pieces together. Yes.
That would make sense.
Yeah, that would make sense. So putting the pieces together is interesting, and sometimes you don't guess right, but this is kind of what we think happened. So we just see, and these are not great pictures, I'm sorry. You know that the Masonic Building is the one with the two windows over the top, the two aerials, I think they're called?
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Over the top. So that's the building. That's where Dennis had his movie rental business for a long time, right here. But when you go inside, and I was just in there the other day, I get really confused about, as you go back in the different theaters, about where they're going. I mean, you know, what part are you really in, because you go off to different places and you walk in and they're so big. Well, when I was in the theater last week before, all the seats are gone. The new people are getting ready to remodel, et cetera, and so it looks really different in there. The building on both sides, the buildings on each side have also been sold, so you're going to be seeing a lot of changes down there. So, okay, anybody have any comments up until now? Erlene?
Yeah, Richard, my husband, he worked at the drive-in for quite a few years, and you know, taking tickets and everything.
Right.
So
That was really an interesting place. Roger?
One of the staples of the movie in the early days was the Western. On Saturday, they always had a Western, and I remember distinctly Gene Autry and Roy Rogers.
Johnny Mac Brown.
Yep.
Yep, those were fun, weren't they? They always said that this is where your parents could give you a quarter. This was Preston's statement, but your parents could give you a quarter. They could send you to the movies. You could buy your ticket, popcorn, a soda, and still have some change to bring home. Those were the days.
My husband was telling me his mother said that she would get a quarter, she and her sister would each get a quarter to go down on Saturday afternoon to watch the movies. And it was years later she figured out, oh, Dad was clearing us out of the house so he and Mom could be together.
Good thought, Barb.
My oldest sister always looked a little bit older than her age,
Mhm.
and Mrs. Peak was bound and determined that she was over 12 and she had to pay 50 cents. My mother took her birth certificate in to prove that she was younger. But I also will say that we lived in Stuart and Bessie Beck's Peak's
Pete's
house.
house, did you?
And Mr. Hitler
Yes,
put in the flagstone floor on our front porch.
really.
So,
Uh,
been there a while.
They really made some differences in Macokota. Carolyn?
Doing the way back when columns for
Yes.
28, 24, 34, 44. I've been amazed when looking at the movies that were in town,
Yes.
how they were almost every night. They changed like 1 or 2 nights.
Mhm.
And I just thought, was there enough people going to movies that they were able to support that many films a week?
Right.
And so many different ones, of course, with some wonderful old actors and actresses.
Sure.
And it's just fun to look.
It is fun to look at, and some of the books that we've been given by Dennis and Dennis's family, some of them are record books and things, and you could see how much they were paying for films and how much they were making, and
Well, and
You
just the top-notch ones were here.
oh, they did, because they wanted to keep people in Macokota. They didn't want you to go have dinner in Davenport and go to a movie in Davenport. Stay in Macokota. They were doing the same thing in Preston.
That's what we're gonna
Roger.
know.
Roger.
One of the things I remember is that we always had to I wanted to get the chores done early when I was a little boy, so we could get to town and get to the first movie. And that was, I'd get the cows in like at 3:30 in the afternoon, so we get the chores done. But it was quite the event, Saturday night.
Saturday night. And you know, when we talked about the grocery stores stayed open until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And farmers would come to town and they'd take their list in. And then they'd go to the movies. And then when the double feature was over, they'd go back to the grocery store and pick up their order and go home. That was just common. That's the way they did it. Don?
As exciting as it was to go to the movies, there's nothing like having a real-life encounter with a real-life movie star. And someone in this room had one with Gene Autry.
Yes, they did.
And I think they should tell that story.
All right. So when the fair was going on before they built Pearson Hall, my dad had a plumbing heating business, whatever business, and they always had a booth, and they were in huge tents on the fairgrounds. And so you'd walk through the booths and you'd see all the businesses and whatever. So one night we had done all that, and we'd locked everything up or shut everything down or whatever, getting ready to go home, going through the parking lot. Well, Gene Autry was the headliner at the Macokota Fair that year. And we were out in the parking lot, walking through the parking lot, and all of a sudden, this huge, big Cadillac kind of car, huge car, just shot backwards and pinned me. I was probably 10, 12, pinned me between his car and the car behind me. And I couldn't move. And my dad was frantic, and I can just remember him pounding. You know how they had the huge old, in the back, it was like a trunk. And my dad was pounding and pounding and pounding and trying to get the guy to move forward, because I was definitely trapped. And he went around and he opened the door and kind of out fell Gene Autry. He had a little too much to drink, and he really didn't have a clue what was going on. And I'm pretty sure my dad put his car in gear and moved it forward so I could get out. Didn't have any broken bones, but I was very bruised for a very long time. But yes, the funny thing was that when like Roger said, when Roy Rogers movies and Gene Autry movies would come to town, we were always there. My brother was a Roy Rogers fan. I was a Gene Autry fan. So that was just kind of funny.
I remember Vera Siebel worked at the window too, and
Okay.
she also worked at the police station. And then we have to remember Stubble's Barber Shop was close by there. I stood in line lots of times with my dad to get into Stubble's Barber Shop.
Barber Shop.
Right there along by the theater.
Okay, that's great.
Well, I'm
Okay.
not from Macokota,
This is a teaser.
Okay,
What's to come.
from
All right.
Davenport, but I know my husband was born in 1945, and he remembers going to one of the neighborhood theaters down in the west end of Davenport, and they had serials. So you'd watch the first part of it, you'd pay like a nickel or a dime, like you said, and then they'd tease you to come back next weekend and see. It just would go, it'd be like,
oh,
I don't know how many were in the series, but he said you had to come back. You couldn't miss the next part of the movie.
oh, that's pretty neat.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that they did that.
So I'm guessing that would have been the,
Maybe only Davenport was smart enough to do that. I don't know, I don't
yeah,
remember
would have
that.
had to been in the early 50s probably.
Okay, so these ladies have some wonderful stories to tell about movie theaters in Davenport.
So, yeah, this will be a teaser because I'm going to try to get Bob King here, and he's a classic movie buff. He does magazines, and he had a movie showing, you know, off the reel, the good stuff. But Carol and I both worked at the Coronet Theater, Harrison Street, up on the hill. I was in that ticket booth when they started out.
Okay, the Guilty Cage.
What's New Pussycat was playing.
Oh,
But they remodeled the theater
So I never sat in the
for
Guilty.
Sound of Music.
oh.
And then we had Dr. Zhivago, reserved seating.
And it was over, yeah, we had tickets. We had to reserve.
Yeah.
People would call in and we'd get
that's
them
neat.
tickets and put them in envelopes.
It was quite a deal, but it was the best job I ever had working at that
Working at
theater.
that theater.
So I've
yeah.
got stuff I can show you and tell you along with Bob King. I'd love to do that.
Okay, will you try to come back and do that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But the history, I mean, there was a German theater in 1909 in Davenport, and it says women are supposed to sit in the balcony.
Oh,
A German theater.
German theater.
Women in the balcony.
okay.
I mean, there were 30-some movie theaters in Davenport at one time.
Is that right?
The funny story about the Cornet where we worked, the popcorn machine was behind the screen because it seated 375 people. And if somebody didn't have the foresight to make sure we had enough popcorn, you'd have to pop it during the show.
Oh, my goodness.
And if my boss ever found out, he'd have a fit, because there'd be a faint light from the popcorn machine, so on one part of the screen, and you could hear this.
Oh, how funny. But you could smell it and everybody wanted to go buy more.
But we had the ushers with flashlights and all that.
Okay, that's
I got
great.
to meet Dick
So you're gonna
Clark.
try to get him to come, right?
Yes.
And you two will come back and do a program
I
for
will.
us?
She's Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, that'll be wonderful.
Okay.
Okay, question for everybody. It's noon, it's 1 o'clock. We still haven't talked, I'm sorry. We still haven't talked about Preston. We still haven't talked about Bellevue. We still haven't talked about the little theater in Baldwin and the little theater in Monmouth, which we don't have very much information about. Do you want to keep going, or should we do this another day? Another day?
Next week.
Next week? Next week works. Only if you who have pictures and stories and whatever, will bring them so we have lots of extra information, okay? And then we'll talk about it next week. And we'll talk about, there's the other part. Whoops. Sorry, oh, there.
Oh, there's the
We'll talk
61
about the drive-in theater.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so next week, we're going to do theaters again. Thank you so much, and please come back with more stories. The more you think, the more stories you'll have. Thank you.